I'm so glad you're here. My name is Frances, and I'm a 68-year-old widow who has always believed that family and faith are the cornerstones of a good life. If you're watching this, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing my story of revenge from. On Christmas Eve, my only son Jackson announced he was moving his wife and children to France, planning to leave me behind with nothing but a cold goodbye. He thought he was starting a new life, free from his old mother. But the moment his plane landed in Paris, I made a single phone call that froze every credit card, every bank account, every dollar he thought he had. They thought I was a quiet, church-going woman they could easily discard. They had no idea I was the secret architect of their entire fortune. I want to know how far my story has reached, so stick with me to find out what happens when a mother is left with no choice but to teach her children the true cost of betrayal. The candlelight flickered, casting a warm, golden glow across the dining room table where my family was gathered. Outside, a gentle snow was falling on this December 24th, blanketing our corner of Greenwich, Connecticut, in a holy silence. The air in our home was thick with the scent of fresh pine from the Christmas tree in the living room, a majestic Fraser fir the children had helped me decorate just days before. Mingled with it were the comforting aromas of the gingerbread cookies cooling on the counter and the savory, honey-glazed ham I had spent all afternoon preparing, its surface gleaming under the soft lights. My heart swelled with a quiet, profound joy. My son, Jackson, his wife, Amelia, and my two beautiful grandchildren, Lily and Thomas, were all here, safe and warm. This was everything I had prayed for. My gaze drifted upward to the portrait of my late husband, Robert, hanging proudly above the fireplace. His eyes, so full of life and gentle humor in the painting, seemed to smile down at me. For a moment, I felt his presence beside me, a steadying warmth. I gave a silent promise to him, as I did every year on this sacred evening. I would protect this family, our legacy, with all the wisdom and love I possessed. He had worked his whole life to provide for us, and I considered it my solemn duty to honor that work. "Shall we?" I said softly, my voice filled with emotion as I reached for my grandchildren's small hands. Around the table, we all bowed our heads. The fire crackling softly in the hearth. "Dear Lord," I began, my voice clear in the reverent quiet, "we thank you for this blessed Christmas Eve, for the food on our table, and for the precious gift of family that you have bestowed upon us. We ask you to watch over us, to keep us united in love and harmony, now and always. Guide our hearts and bless this home. Amen." "Amen," echoed around the table, a soft chorus of agreement. The meal began with a cheerful clatter of silverware against my best china. Lily, at 7, was chattering excitedly about Santa Claus, while 4-year-old Thomas was more focused on trying to sneak a piece of ham from his plate. I watched them, my heart overflowing, but a small, dissonant note played beneath the festive harmony. Jackson seemed restless, his knee bouncing under the table, his eyes avoiding mine. Amelia, though smiling, had a brittle quality to her cheer, a certain impatience in the way she glanced at her phone, which she'd placed face down beside her plate. It was between the main course and the apple pie that Amelia clinked her glass with a fork, a sound that cut through the children's laughter. A bright, almost theatrical smile was plastered on her face. "Everyone," she announced, her voice a little too loud, projecting an excitement that felt manufactured. "Jackson and I have a very special Christmas surprise for you all." I smiled back, my own happiness making me momentarily blind. I expected an announcement about a new job promotion for Jackson, or perhaps, God willing, another grandchild on the way. Instead, her next words shattered the fragile peace of the evening like a stone through a stained glass window. "We're moving to Paris, right after the new year. Jackson received an incredible offer from an international firm, and we've decided it's time for us to finally start our own life, to have some space to grow as a family." The silver fork in my hand clattered onto my plate. The room fell so silent I could hear the gentle hiss of the falling snow outside. Stunned, I looked at Jackson, whose face was a mask of strained apology. "Mom, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," he mumbled, his eyes suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his mashed potatoes. "We couldn't pass it up." Paris. The word echoed in the sudden cavernous emptiness of the room. It felt as distant and cold as the moon. They were leaving, not just moving to another state, but to another continent. They were abandoning me here, and they had chosen Christmas Eve, the holiest night of family togetherness, to deliver the blow. Amelia, ever perceptive, noticed my shock and placed a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. Her touch was as cold as her words. "Don't worry, Frances," she said, her tone dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We'll call you often. Besides, at your age, a quiet life is better, don't you think?" Her words, meant to sound comforting, were a brutal dismissal, a casual pronouncement that my active life was over, that I was now simply an obligation to be managed from afar. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of forced conversation and hollow laughter. The delicious ham tasted like ash in my mouth. Before I could find my voice, before I could even begin to process the magnitude of this betrayal, Jackson cleared his throat, rushing to fill the heavy silence. "Mom," he said, finally lifting his gaze, though it was shifty and uncertain. "There is some paperwork we need to sort out before we go, just to make it easier for me to, take care of you from a distance." The warmth of Christmas Eve had evaporated, leaving behind a chilling betrayal that seeped into the very floorboards of my home. I spent a sleepless night on the living room sofa, the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree casting long, dancing shadows that felt more like specters than festive decorations. My mind replayed the scene at the dinner table, each word a fresh wound. In the cold, quiet hours before dawn, Robert's voice, a memory as clear as day, echoed in my mind, a solemn warning from the past. "Never give away your power of decision, Frances, unless you trust their heart completely." Did I trust Jackson's heart anymore? I no longer knew. On the morning of December 25th, the day we were meant to celebrate the birth of our Savior, I tried to salvage what was left of the holiday. I hoped, with the desperate faith of a mother, that last night was a bad dream, a terrible misunderstanding fueled by holiday stress. I found Jackson in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee, the cold weight of the porcelain mug in his hands. "Jackson," I began, my voice softer than I intended, a plea for the son I knew. "About Paris. Can we please talk about this? It all feels so sudden, so final." He flinched, his shoulders tensing as if bracing for a blow. "There's nothing to talk about, Mom. It's a done deal." He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the swirling steam rising from his cup. It was then that Amelia walked in, fully dressed in a sharp, stylish outfit, radiating an unnerving cheerfulness that felt entirely out of place. In her hands, she held a thick manila folder. "Good morning, Frances. Merry Christmas," she chirped, her voice gratingly bright. She placed the folder on the polished oak table with a decisive thud that echoed in the tense silence. "Since we're all here, now is the perfect time to sort out that paperwork Jackson mentioned." Her eyes, hard and expectant, bore into my son. Under her watchful gaze, Jackson reluctantly slid the folder towards me. His hand trembled slightly, and he still refused to meet my eyes. My own hands felt cold as I opened it and saw the bold heading, a stark black title on a crisp white page, "Full Power of Attorney." "This document will allow me to manage your finances and make medical decisions for you from France," Jackson explained, his voice flat and rehearsed, as if he were reading from a script Amelia had written for him. "It's just to make things easier, to ensure you're taken care of." My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, my blood turning to ice. My breath hitched as I landed on the key phrases, the venom hidden in the fine print. the unconditional right to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of any and all real property, and the authority to liquidate any and all financial assets, including but not limited to stocks, bonds, and savings accounts. This wasn't a document for my care. It was a complete surrender of my life, a legal instrument to strip me of everything Robert and I had ever built. It was a death warrant for my independence. I slowly pushed the folder back across the table. "No," I said, my voice quiet but as unbreakable as steel. "I will not sign this." Jackson looked up, stunned, his mouth slightly agape. But it was Amelia who exploded. Her sweet facade crumbled instantly, revealing the raw, ugly impatience beneath. "I don't understand what you're waiting for," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She took a step closer, her hands on her hips. "He's your only son. Don't you trust your own son?" I stood my ground, my gaze locked not on her, but on Jackson, willing him to see the abyss he was pushing us into, to see the stranger he was becoming. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. Finally, a flash of anger crossed his face, the anger of a guilty child caught in a lie. He snatched the folder from the table and stormed towards the door, unable to face me. As they were leaving, Amelia paused in the doorway. She turned, her eyes narrowed into cold reptilian slits, and her voice was a low, venomous hiss. "You will regret this selfishness, Francis." The front door slammed shut, its echo a declaration of war. The house was deafeningly quiet. Each tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer blow, counting down to a disaster I couldn't yet name. The days following Christmas bled into one another, a gray, lonely blur. The festive decorations which had brought me such joy just a few days prior now seemed to mock me from the walls. The half-eaten gingerbread cookies on the counter were stale, a bitter reminder of the feast that had turned to ashes in my mouth. I found myself remembering all the times over the past few years Jackson had called, his voice tight with urgency, asking for money for some emergency investment or an unexpected expense. I had always transferred the funds without question, my heart aching for the struggles of my only son. Now, those memories felt less like acts of motherly love and more like a fool's errands. I tried calling him on December 26th, then again on the 27th. Each call went straight to voicemail, a cold digital wall of silence. Finally, a text message from Amelia lit up my phone screen. It wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was a command. "We are busy preparing. You should reconsider your decision." The message was devoid of any warmth. A transactional and chilling dismissal that made it clear I was no longer a mother to be consulted, but a problem to be managed. Overwhelmed by a mix of grief and suspicion, I sought refuge where I always did, St. Mary's Church. The cavernous space was empty, save for the flickering votive candles casting a soft glow in the afternoon gloom. I knelt in the familiar wooden pew, the scent of old incense and wax, a balm to my frayed nerves. I tried to pray, to ask God for guidance, for the strength to forgive my son for this cruel turn. But the words felt hollow in my heart, which was a knot of raw anger and profound sorrow. How could I pray for harmony when my own son was treating me like an obstacle? Was it a sin to doubt him? The love of a mother, I thought, should be unconditional. But what if that love was being used as a weapon against me? A cold dread settled in my heart, and with it a sliver of clarity. I needed truth, not just faith. Back home, I walked into Robert's old study, a room I had kept exactly as he had left it. I pulled out his leather-bound address book from the top desk drawer. My fingers, trembling, flipped through the worn pages until they landed on a crisp, white business card tucked neatly into the C section. David Chen, attorney at law, Robert's closest friend and our family's lawyer for over 30 years. He'd been a rock for me when Robert passed, a steady presence in the storm of grief. A wave of resolve washed over me. I picked up the phone and dialed his office. A polite receptionist answered. "Chen and Associates. How may I help you?" "Hello," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "My name is Frances Miller. I'd like to make an appointment with Mr. Chen. It's a personal matter." As she was checking his schedule, a voice drifted through from the background of her office, muffled but unmistakable. It was a voice I knew all too well, high, sharp, and laced with entitlement. It was Amelia. "And what are our legal options if she continues to be uncooperative?" she was saying to someone, her words cutting through the air like shards of glass. The receptionist's voice faded into a dull roar in my ears. They were already there, in David's building. They were plotting their next move, seeking legal counsel to force my hand. I hung up the phone before the receptionist could return, my hand clammy, my heart pounding against my ribs. They were a step ahead of me. I had to act faster. My hand was shaking as I placed the receiver back in its cradle. Amelia's voice, sharp and conspiratorial, echoed in the silent house, a horrifying confirmation of my worst fears. They were actively plotting, using lawyers to find a way around my refusal. A cold fury, clean and sharp, began to replace the fog of my grief. I remembered David Chen's words to me at Robert's funeral, his hand gently on my shoulder as he stood by me at the graveside. "Whenever you need anything, Frances, Robert's legacy is protected. I made him that promise." I had not understood the full weight of his words then, but I was beginning to now. I had to see him. The next morning, on December 28th, I drove into downtown Greenwich, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The opulence of David Chen's law office, with its mahogany walls, shelves of leather-bound books and plush chairs, felt like a world away from my quiet, simple life. I felt small and out of place, a sparrow in a cage of eagles, a simple woman about to discuss the ugly unraveling of her family. David greeted me not with the formal handshake of a lawyer, but with the warm, sad eyes of an old friend who knew that a visit like this could only mean trouble. "Frances," he said, his voice gentle as he led me into his private office. "It's been too long. Please sit. Tell me what's wrong." And so I did. I told him everything, my voice low and steady, recounting the facts as if they had happened to someone else. I spoke of the shocking Christmas Eve announcement, the cruel demand for power of attorney, and the chilling sound of Amelia's voice in his own office building just yesterday. I spoke without tears, the pain too deep for them. David listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim. When I finished, he didn't offer empty condolences or platitudes. Instead, he stood, walked to a large, secure filing cabinet in the corner of the room, and retrieved a thick, leather-bound portfolio embossed with 2 words in gold leaf, "The Miller Trust." He placed it on the polished desk between us with a soft, definitive thud. "Frances, Robert was a brilliant man, but more than that, he was a cautious one. He loved Jackson deeply, but he wasn't blind to his weaknesses or to the world's temptations. He set this up years ago, not to control Jackson, but to protect you." He opened the portfolio, revealing pages of dense legal text, signatures, and schedules. "This is the Miller Family Trust. It holds everything: the house, the investment portfolio, all the liquid assets. When Robert passed, he appointed you as the sole trustee." I stared at him, confused by the legal term. "Sole trustee? What does that mean, David?" "It means," he said, leaning forward, his voice clear and precise, his gaze locking with mine, "that you, and only you, have control. Jackson has no direct legal claim or access to the principal funds, the credit cards he uses, the bank accounts he draws from. They are all subsidiary accounts, funded and guaranteed by the trust, accounts that you, as the sole trustee, have the absolute authority to freeze, limit, or shut down entirely, at any time, for any reason." The weight of his words settled over me, a stunning, breathtaking revelation. a power I never knew I had, a weapon I never thought I'd need. I was not the helpless widow they saw. I was the gatekeeper. Absolute authority? I whispered, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. David nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. You hold all the cards, Francis. He paused, his expression hardening. He turned to the large computer monitor on his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard. They thought you were a liability they needed to manage. The truth is, you've been their lifeline. He swiveled the screen to face me, a complex spreadsheet of financial data beginning to load, columns of numbers waiting to tell their secrets. Now, he said, his voice low and serious, let's see what they've really been doing with your generosity. The numbers on David's computer screen blurred into an abstract pattern, a foreign language of debits and credits that my mind refused to process. But as he began to speak, his voice calm and methodical, that pattern resolved into a horrifying story of greed, line by sickening line. Each transaction was a small, sharp betrayal. This first spreadsheet, Francis, is the primary credit card account linked to the trust, he said, pointing to a long, scrolling column of transactions that seemed to have no end. The one Jackson has been using for years, for what he told you were business expenses and general family needs. My eyes scanned the list, my stomach churning with a nauseating mix of disbelief and recognition. I saw names I knew, restaurants, department stores, but the amounts were staggering, beyond anything I could have comprehended. David's finger tapped the screen, highlighting a single charge. Here, he said, his voice flat. A charge for $5,000 at a boutique in Soho. My mind flashed back with perfect, painful clarity to Amelia at my last birthday. She had been showing off a new, ridiculously expensive-looking handbag, a confection of Italian leather and gold hardware. When I'd commented on it, she had laughed it off, claiming she'd found it at an outlet for practically nothing. It was a steal, she had said, winking. Now I saw the truth. The steal was from me. Another charge for $10,000 was from a 5-star ski resort in Aspen, dated last February. Jackson had told me it was a mandatory company-sponsored retreat, a reward for top performers. He had even sounded weary when he mentioned it, complaining about having to be away from the family. I had felt a pang of sympathy for him then, for the pressures of his career. Now, the memory made me feel physically ill. He had lied to my face, painting a picture of corporate servitude while he and Amelia were living a life of luxury on my dime. On Robert's legacy, lie after lie, all funded by the financial security my husband had built to keep me safe. It was my money, my life savings being squandered on a fantasy life while I counted my pennies for groceries, believing I was helping them through a rough patch. It gets worse, David said, his jaw tightening with an anger he was clearly trying to suppress on my behalf. He clicked to another file, this one filled with official-looking correspondence from the bank, stamped with dates and formal letterheads. Over the last 12 months, Jackson has made 3 separate attempts to use the trust's assets as collateral for significant personal loans. One for $100,000, another for $250,000. But could he even do that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The idea that he would try to mortgage my very home, the bedrock of my security, was a violation I couldn't fathom. No, Robert was smarter than that. He structured the trust to be ironclad. The assets cannot be leveraged for debt. My office and the bank were alerted each time, and the requests were summarily denied. He pointed to a line in one of the letters. See here? This is from Mr. Peterson himself. He personally flagged the activity as highly irregular and inconsistent with the stated purpose of the trust. Jackson was testing the defenses, Francis, probing for a weakness, hoping to find a loophole he could exploit. The cold, calculated nature of it all left me breathless. This wasn't just frivolous spending driven by youthful irresponsibility. This was a systematic assault, a siege against the financial fortress Robert had built around me. He was actively trying to break in. Then, David opened the final folder. His face was grim. The air in the room grew heavy, the professional calm replaced by a shared sense of dread. "This is the one that proves their intent beyond any doubt," he said. He highlighted a single transaction from just weeks ago, dated December 3rd. It was a wire transfer, $20,000, a non-refundable down payment to a luxury real estate agency on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. I stared at the name, a place of impossible glamour and expense. The plan to abandon me wasn't a spontaneous holiday announcement born of a sudden opportunity. It was a meticulously planned escape, funded by the very person they were leaving behind. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt the air leave my lungs, my vision tunneling slightly. But the final blow, the one that extinguished the last flicker of motherly compassion in my heart, was a small, almost insignificant charge on the statement from just 2 days ago. It was a $500 payment, a retainer fee, to a law firm in downtown Greenwich, a firm that was not Chen and Associates. I recognized the name from the building directory I had passed on my way in. It was the office Amelia had been in. They were using my money to pay lawyers to figure out how to steal the rest of my money. Just as I was processing this ultimate sickening betrayal, a notification popped up in the corner of David's screen, an email from the bank. Its subject line in bold red letters, "Urgent notification, action required." David clicked it open. He read it aloud, his voice flat and cold. "Emergency credit limit increase request from Mr. Jackson Miller has been denied due to insufficient justification and existing trustee restrictions. This marks the 4th such request in 2 months." David looked at me, his eyes dark with a grim certainty. "They're desperate, Francis," he said, his voice low. "Their well is running dry and they know it. They won't stop." Leaving David's office, the bustling streets of Greenwich seemed to fade into a dull, muted gray. The cold, hard proof of their betrayal, the spreadsheets, the loan applications, the $20,000 down payment on a life without me, had triggered a crisis not just in my family, but deep within my soul. I drove on autopilot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my car eventually finding its way to the familiar, quiet grounds of St. Mary's Church. I remembered Father Michael's sermons on forgiveness, on turning the other cheek, and wondered if I possessed the grace to forgive a sin of this magnitude, a betrayal so profound and calculated. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the empty pews in hues of sapphire and ruby. The air was still and cool, heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and a faith that suddenly felt 1,000,000 miles away. I knelt in my usual spot, the worn velvet of the kneeler a familiar comfort. I tried to form the words of a prayer, to ask God for guidance, but my heart was a knot of raw anger and profound sorrow. Every time I tried to pray for peace, the image of that $500 charge for a lawyer, my money used to plot against me, flashed in my mind. Every time I whispered, "Forgive us our trespasses," I heard Amelia's triumphant voice on the phone, her casual cruelty a poison in my memory. My gaze fell upon the worn Bible tucked into the rack in front of me. My hand, still trembling slightly, opened it to the book of Proverbs, a place Robert often turned to for practical worldly wisdom. My eyes scanned the verses, searching for solace, for an answer, for anything that could quiet the storm inside me. I read of integrity and of duplicity. I read of the consequences that befall those who build their houses on deceit. And then I read about stewardship. The verses spoke of being a faithful caretaker of the gifts one has been given, of the profound responsibility that comes with managing a legacy. And then a new understanding settled over me, painful but as clear as the light filtering through the window. This wasn't about revenge. It couldn't be. Revenge was a sin, a poison to the soul that would only consume me. This had to be something else. It had to be an act of tough love. By allowing Jackson to continue down this path, by endlessly funding his deceptions and enabling his greed, I wasn't helping him. I was participating in the corrosion of his character, the slow death of his soul. The only way for him to have any hope of finding his way back, of becoming the man Robert and I had raised him to be, was to let him fall. He needed to face the cold, hard consequences of his choices without my money to cushion the impact. I looked up at the crucifix hanging high above the altar, at the image of ultimate sacrifice and love. A profound sadness washed over me for the son I had lost to the temptations of the world and for the painful action I knew I must now take. "Lord," I whispered, tears finally tracing hot paths down my cheeks, "forgive me for the pain I am about to cause, but I must protect Robert's legacy, and I must teach my son a lesson that, God willing, might one day save his soul." I left the church with a heavy heart, but with the unshakable resolve of a woman who had found her purpose. The internal war was over. I pulled out my phone, my hand steady, and dialed David. He answered immediately. "David," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I've made my decision. Let them go to France." The decision was made like a stone had been cast, and I knew there was no turning back. The peace and resolve I had found in the church was not a fleeting emotion. It had settled into a firm, cold foundation inside of me. Now, every action I took was deliberate. There were no more tears, no more hesitation. The next morning, I drove to the local bank branch in downtown Greenwich, where my family had been clients for over 3 decades. I remembered coming here with Robert and later, alone, always greeted by a familiar face, Mr. Peterson, the branch manager. He was a temperate man with salt and pepper hair and impeccably tailored suits, a picture of stability and trustworthiness from another era. He always greeted me with respect, asking after my garden and the grandchildren. Today I arrived to make a routine transaction, a pretense to be there. As I was finishing with the teller, I saw Mr. Peterson emerge from his private office. Our eyes met and he gave me a professional nod. I noticed, however, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, something different from his usual polite demeanor. After my transaction was complete, Mr. Peterson approached me. "Mrs. Miller, it's good to see you," he said, his tone as courteous as ever. "Do you have a few moments? I'd like to speak with you in my office." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression perfectly calm. "Of course, Mr. Peterson." His office was neat and formal, with oak-paneled walls and the faint scent of paper and leather. He invited me to sit and then quietly closed the door, creating a space of privacy and seriousness. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his face etched with concern, "I hope you don't mind my saying this, as it's a bit outside of my professional scope. But as the man who has managed your family's accounts for 20 years, I feel a sense of duty." I remained silent, waiting. "Recently," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "your son, Jackson, has made several highly unusual requests. Specifically, he attempted to use your home, the primary asset secured by the Miller Trust, as collateral for a significant personal loan." The air in the room grew thick. Though David had already shown me the paperwork, hearing it confirmed by the man on the inside sent a chill down my spine. "We denied the requests, of course," Mr. Peterson said quickly. "The trust is structured ironclad, and any such action requires your signature as the sole trustee, but his recklessness was enough to trigger several alerts in our system." He paused, looking directly into my eyes. And I saw not just professionalism, but genuine care. "Your husband, Robert, was a very prudent man, ma'am. When he set up this trust with us, he insisted on multiple layers of security alerts. Any attempt to leverage assets, alter the structure, or request sudden credit extensions above a certain threshold automatically sends a red flag directly to my desk. I felt it was my duty to inform you that someone is testing the very defenses he built to protect you. I finally spoke, my voice surprisingly steady. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. This information is very helpful. Mr. Peterson nodded, seemingly relieved that I had not dismissed his warning. He opened his desk drawer and took out a business card. With a fountain pen, he wrote a string of numbers on the back and pushed it across the polished desk toward me. This is my personal cell phone number, he said, his voice low and firm. Your husband was a fine man and a valued client. I consider protecting his legacy a part of my job. If you need an emergency freeze placed on the accounts day or night, call this number. Don't go through the main switchboard. Call me directly. I will handle it immediately. I picked up the business card. The small piece of paper felt impossibly heavy in my hand. It was more than a phone number. It was a weapon. It was the final confirmation. As I left the bank, I knew I was no longer alone in this fight. I had my lawyer, I had the truth, and now I had an ally at the very heart of the financial system. The plan was ready. All that was missing was for the main actor to step onto the stage. Armed with the secret of a banker and the plan of a lawyer, I knew it was time to play the most difficult role of my life, that of the defeated, compliant mother. The telephone felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, a cold weight of finality. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I took a deep, steadying breath, summoning the image of Amelia's condescending smile, her casual mention of my impending quiet life, and used that sting of humiliation to fuel my performance. I dialed Jackson's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary, defensive. Mom? I let out a long, shaky sigh, a sound I had practiced in my head a dozen times. Jackson, I began, my voice intentionally frail, laced with a weary resignation that I hoped sounded like heartbreak. I've been thinking. I'm too old for this fighting. I don't want to spend my final years at odds with my only son, with lawyers and anger. There was a pause on the other end, a silence filled with his cautious relief. Mom, are you saying you understand? I'm saying I'm tired, I replied, allowing a slight crack in my voice, a tremor of surrender. I don't want to stand in the way of your happiness. If Paris is what you and Amelia truly want, then I won't fight it anymore. I let the words hang in the air, a carefully crafted white flag. I just want you to be happy. The relief in his voice was palpable, a rush of air as if he had been holding his breath for days. Oh, Mom, thank you. You've made the right decision. We've made the right decision for everyone. Suddenly, I heard a rustle on the line, the sound of the phone being passed, and then Amelia's voice, syrupy and triumphant, poured into my ear. Oh, Francis, you've made the right decision. We knew you'd come around. You'll see. You'll be so much more peaceful this way. There it was, that patronizing tone, twisting my own words into a confirmation of my supposed decline. Would you like to know the flight details? We leave in 2 weeks. This was the moment. I gathered all the feigned fragility I could muster, letting my voice drop to a near whisper. Yes, dear, I said, sounding weak and resigned. Please, I'd like to know the exact time you'll be landing, so I can pray for your safe arrival. Amelia, completely disarmed by this pious surrender, happily read out the flight number, the departure time from JFK, and the arrival time at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. We'll call you the moment we get through customs, she chirped, her voice dripping with the satisfaction of a battle won. Thank you, dear, I said softly, and ended the call. The click of the receiver was like the cocking of a gun. The sorrowful, trembling mask fell away from my face, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. My hand, which had feigned a tremor just moments before, was perfectly steady as I picked up a pen. On a crisp white notepad, I wrote down the flight number and the date. Then I drew a precise, deliberate circle around the arrival time. The countdown had begun. The final days before their flight were a silent, agonizing pantomime, a play where smiles concealed daggers and every polite word was laced with poison. A week before their departure, I hosted them for one last farewell dinner. As I prepared the roast chicken, the same recipe Jackson had loved since he was a boy, a wave of profound sadness washed over me. The familiar scent of rosemary and thyme filled the kitchen, but it was mingled with the bitter aroma of finality. I wondered if this would be the last meal I ever cooked for him, the last futile act of a mother's love. The meal was as strained as I had anticipated. I played my part, the quiet, heartbroken mother, saying little and observing everything from behind a veil of sorrow. I passed the mashed potatoes and refilled their water glasses, my movements slow and deliberate. Jackson, for his part, tried to fill the silence with forced cheerfulness, talking too loudly about the weather, about a football game, about anything other than the gaping chasm that had opened between us. He couldn't quite hide the guilt that flickered in his eyes whenever he thought I wasn't looking. It was Amelia who dominated the evening. She chattered endlessly about Paris, painting a picture of a life that I knew was a fantasy built on my money, a future stolen from my past. "The apartment we found is simply divine, Francis," she gloated, swirling the wine in her glass, a vintage I knew cost over $100 a bottle. "It's in the 7th arrondissement, just a short walk from the Eiffel Tower. And the schools for Lily and Thomas, top tier, of course. They'll be fluent in French in no time." I just nodded, my silence a stark contrast to her bubbly enthusiasm. Before they left, I gave the children their gifts. They were not expensive toys, but things of personal, irreplaceable value. For Lily, I gave my own mother's silver locket, a delicate oval engraved with her initials. For Thomas, I gave him Robert's first edition copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, its pages worn and softened by my husband's hands. "So you'll remember your grandma," I whispered, hugging them tightly, burying my face in their hair one last time. Jackson, perhaps struck by a final, fleeting pang of conscience, came to me as they were putting on their coats. He wrapped his arms around me in a stiff, awkward hug that felt more like a formality than an expression of love. "I'll miss you, Mom," he mumbled into my shoulder. I held him for a moment, the ghost of the little boy I once knew, and I felt a tear escape and trace a path down my cheek. I let him believe it was a tear of sorrow. My voice, when I spoke, was eerily calm. "I know you will, Jackson, more than you can possibly imagine." I let him go. As they walked out the door, I stood in the entryway watching them leave, the cold night air rushing in. It was then that I heard Amelia's sharp, urgent whisper, carried back on the wind, a sound not meant for my ears. "Did you get the key to the bank safe deposit box?" I froze, my blood turning to ice. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a gasp. They wanted more than just the house. They wanted everything. They wanted to empty the last vestige of my life with Robert, down to the very last piece of paper, the very last memory, the safe deposit box key. Their greed was bottomless. It wasn't jewels or stock certificates they were after. The box held little of monetary value. It held Robert's wedding band, which I had placed there after he passed. It held my parents' letters from the war and the first tooth Jackson ever lost, wrapped in a piece of silk. They didn't want the items. They wanted the emptiness. The erasure of every last trace of the life Robert and I had built, a life they clearly saw as their rightful inheritance to be liquidated. The thought was a cold, hard stone in my chest as I drove them to John F. Kennedy International Airport on that gray January morning. I remembered other trips that had started from this very airport years ago when we were still a family. I recalled the trip to Florida for spring break when Jackson was 10, the car filled with his excited laughter and our off-key singing, his small hand clutching mine in anticipation as we watched the planes take off. Today, the car was a cavern of tense silence, broken only by Amelia's excited chatter into her phone about the divine little bistro she had booked for their first night in Paris, and the children's weary questions. The scene at the check-in counter was a testament to their ambition. A mountain of oversized designer luggage, far more than any family needed for a simple move, was piled onto a cart. While Jackson hurried through the logistics, avoiding my eyes as if my gaze physically burned him, and Amelia fussed over a misplaced hat box, I sat with Lily and Thomas on a hard plastic bench. They were tired and confused, clinging to me as their only anchor in this whirlwind. I read them a story from a small book I had brought, my voice a low, steady murmur in the chaotic symphony of airport announcements and rolling suitcases. I was creating one last small island of calm for them before the storm. The time came to walk them to the security gate. This was the final act. I knelt down and hugged my grandchildren, burying my face in their hair, inhaling their innocent scent of soap and childhood. "Grandma loves you very much," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion they were too young to understand. "Be good children." I stood and faced my son. The moment was awkward, a chasm of unspoken truths stretching between us. He gave me a quick, almost perfunctory hug, his arms barely closing around me before pulling away. "Call me as soon as you land," I reminded him, my voice a placid, calm surface above a raging sea. He nodded, already turning away, his mind on the gates and the new life ahead. "I will, Mom. I promise." He had no idea what that call would truly signify. Amelia didn't bother with the pretense of an embrace. She was already ushering the children forward. She simply paused, looked back at me, and waved a dismissive hand. A triumphant, cutting smile played on her lips. "Goodbye, Francis," she said, her voice dripping with finality. "Do try and take care of yourself." I stood there, a statue of a grieving mother, and watched them pass through the security gate. I watched until their figures, Jackson's tense shoulders, Amelia's confident stride, and the two small children trailing behind them, were swallowed by the crowd. Then, and only then, did I let the mask drop. The sorrow on my face vanished, replaced by a cold, quiet determination. I turned away from the gate and looked up at the massive flight information board. I found their flight number, AF009 to Paris, and noted the word now flashing beside it in bright green letters, "Departed." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. It was time. The tiny blip on the flight radar crawled across the vast blue of the Atlantic on my laptop screen, an insignificant speck carrying the entire shattered weight of my world. Each millimeter of its progress was a heavy, deliberate beat against my ribs, a slow 7-hour funeral march for the son I once knew. My gaze drifted to Robert's photograph on the mantelpiece, his kind eyes seeming to watch me from across the room, his painted smile a silent witness to my lonely vigil. "I will do the right thing, my love," I whispered into the stillness of my living room. "The right thing by you and even by him." I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. The pale morning light had long since given way to the flat gray of a January afternoon. It was a 7-hour vigil, a long, silent prayer where I asked not for my son's happiness, but for his reckoning. I had poured him tea in this very room, watched him grow from a boy into a man, and now I was watching him fly away, blissfully unaware that the world he thought he was escaping to was about to become his prison. The house was a tomb of memories, each one now tainted by the knowledge of what was to come. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember his childhood laughter echoing in these halls, the scraped knees I had bandaged, the bedtime stories I had read. I thought of a time when he was 8, how he had broken a small vase and tried to hide the pieces, his face a perfect mask of innocence. I hadn't been angry. I had simply knelt down, helped him pick up the shards, and explained that the truth, no matter how difficult, was always the better path. Where had that boy gone? A wave of profound maternal grief washed over me. It was a true mourning, not for a person who had died, but for a soul that had become lost. This was not an act of hate. I had to believe that. It was the last, most painful act of a mother's love, the kind that prunes a branch harshly so that the tree itself might survive. I walked into Robert's study, the air still holding the faint scent of his pipe tobacco and old books. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool surface of his globe, tracing the path with my fingertip from Connecticut to Paris, a scar across the face of the earth. In a small drawer, I found a photograph of Jackson at his college graduation, his arm around me, his smile wide and full of promise. I had been so proud that day. Now the pride was replaced by a hollow ache. Then, after an eternity that spanned 7 hours and 23 minutes, the screen refreshed. A block of green text appeared, stark and final. Landed. A stillness settled over me, a profound calm that pushed away the storm of emotions. The time for grief and doubt was over. Now was the time for action. I took a deep, steadying breath, the air feeling cool and clean in my lungs for the first time in days. I picked up my phone, my hand perfectly steady, and dialed the personal number Mr. Peterson had given me. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and professional, expecting my call. Peterson. I did not waste a word on pleasantries. I spoke the code we had agreed upon, my voice even and clear, the words a strange prayer of their own, a final, somber amen. Robert's garden is ready for spring? There was a brief, professional pause on the other end, the quiet sound of a keyboard clicking, a sound that sealed their fate. Then his voice came back, firm and absolute. It's done, Mrs. Miller. All subsidiary credit and debit accounts linked to the trust have been frozen. The directive is effective immediately. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, I said, and ended the call. I had just placed my phone down on the polished wood of the end table when it buzzed to life, the vibration sharp and violent against the silence. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number, an international number, prefixed by the country code for France. Jackson. I watched it ring, the sound shrill and frantic in the quiet room, and I let it ring. The phone rang again, then again, a frantic, desperate rhythm slicing through the quiet sanctity of my home. The sound was a world away from the chaos I knew was unfolding across the ocean, a chaos I had single-handedly orchestrated. Each shrill ring felt like a validation, a signal flare of desperation from the new world my son had so eagerly chosen. I thought of them standing at that airport, so confident in their plans for a glorious, new life in Paris, a life built on deceit and my quiet suffering. I let it ring a fourth time, allowing their panic to marinate, to strip away the last layers of their arrogance. Finally, with the calm of a surgeon picking up a scalpel, I answered the call. I pressed the button and put the phone on speaker, placing it in the center of the grand, empty dining room table. The first sound was not a greeting, but a raw, panicked shout that crackled across the 7-hour distance. "Mom! Mom! What did you do?" It was Jackson, his voice a ragged mess of disbelief and fury, stretched thin over the transatlantic line. In the background, I could hear a cacophony of rolling suitcases, garbled announcements in a language he did not understand, and the high-pitched, terrified wail of my own granddaughter, Lily. "The cards don't work, none of them. We're stuck here, Mom. We can't even get a taxi." I remained silent, letting his panic wash over the line, a tidal wave crashing against the rock of my composure. I pictured him there, his handsome face, usually a mask of smug self-assurance, now contorted with a confusion he had never known. His entire sense of entitlement, the very foundation of his being, was crumbling around him. The mountain of designer luggage they had so proudly checked in, a symbol of their new status, was now a useless, immovable monument to their greed. I could hear Amelia screaming in the background, her voice a shrill, incoherent torrent of blame, directed not at me, but at him. This is your fault, Jackson. You said she'd fold. You said she was just a sad old woman." And through it all, the children were crying, their distress a painful but necessary casualty of this long overdue lesson. I closed my eyes, the sound of their tears a sharp sting in my heart, but my resolve did not waver. "Why would you do this?" Jackson yelled again, his voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard before. It was the sound of a man who had never faced a single real consequence in his life, suddenly facing them all at once. "It's Christmas, you're ruining everything." Suddenly, the phone was ripped away, the sound of the struggle an ugly static in my ear. Then Amelia's voice, pure, undiluted venom, exploded through the speaker. You did this! You wicked, evil old woman! I knew you were a spiteful snake. How dare you? You couldn't stand to see us happy, could you? You had to control everything, even from thousands of miles away." She went on, a stream of curses and threats, her hysteria mounting with every word she spat. She called me a miserable, lonely hag, a bitter crone who couldn't let her son live his own life. I listened to it all, my expression unchanged. I heard Thomas cry out for his mother, his small voice lost in her rage. I heard Lily sobbing my name, a small, heartbreaking sound that almost broke my resolve. And through it all, I heard the sound of their perfect world, their stolen future, shattering into a million pieces on the cold, unforgiving floor of the Charles de Gaulle airport. They had wanted a life of European glamour, and I had given them a public spectacle of ruin. Then a new voice cut through her tirade, a man's voice, calm but laced with an authority that was clearly official, speaking in heavily accented English. "Madame, monsieur, you must lower your voices. You are causing a disturbance. I have received multiple complaints. Your children are distressed. This is your final warning. If you do not calm down, I will have to detain you." A sudden shocked silence fell on the other end of the line, broken only by the whimpering of my grandchildren. They had finally attracted the attention they so desperately craved, but not in the way they had planned. In that moment of stunned quiet, as the reality of their public humiliation began to sink in, I finally spoke. "Amelia," I said, my voice cutting through the static like a shard of ice, "put my son on the phone." A heavy silence fell over the line, punctuated only by the faint muffled sound of a distant airport announcement and my granddaughter's soft, exhausted crying. The rage had burned out of Jackson's voice, leaving behind the hollow ash of desperation. The security guard's warning had clearly sobered him. I remembered my words to him just a week ago, a quiet prophecy spoken in the warmth of my home. "I know you will miss me, Jackson, more than you can possibly imagine." I doubt he had imagined this. Finally, his voice returned, stripped of all its arrogance, small and broken, the voice of a boy lost in the woods. "Mom, please. The children. They're scared. We have nothing. We can't even buy them a bottle of water." I let the weight of his plea settle in the quiet of my living room before I spoke. My voice was not angry, nor was it triumphant. It was the calm, steady voice of a final judgment, a truth he should have learned years ago. "For years, Jackson, you have spoken of your desire for independence," I began, my tone even, measured. "You felt that I was a burden, that my life was an obstacle to your own. You wanted to be your own man, free from any obligation. You wanted to build a new life in Paris, a life of your own making." I could hear his sharp intake of breath, a gasp of dawning comprehension. "Well, your independence was never real. It was an illusion, an expensive stage play that I was funding. The entire time, you weren't standing on your own 2 feet. You were standing on your father's legacy." What are you talking about?" he stammered. "Your father was a wise man," I continued, my gaze drifting to his portrait on the mantelpiece. "He knew that wealth could be a temptation, a poison. He created the Miller Trust not as a piggy bank for you to raid, but as a shield to protect this family, to ensure its foundation was secure. He made me its sole guardian. Every dollar you have ever spent on lavish vacations, every designer handbag Amelia has ever flaunted, every check you've written from an account you thought was yours, it all came from the trust. It was a privilege you were granted, Jackson, not a right you were owed. Your father left this legacy to protect our family, not for you to destroy it with greed. He was silent, the truth landing with the force of a physical blow. I let the silence stretch, letting the full weight of his hollow life press down on him. You wanted your independence, I said, my voice unwavering. As of this moment, you have it. But the children are innocent in this. They do not deserve to pay for your sins, and they will not. I paused, letting my conditions sink in, each word a carefully placed stone in the wall I was building between us. I will wire sufficient funds to the United States Embassy in Paris, enough for 3 one-way tickets, economy class, back to Connecticut, one for Lily, one for Thomas, and one for a single guardian to accompany them. I trust Amelia will do her duty as their mother. You can figure out your own way home. The silence stretched again, long and agonizing. I could picture him there, amidst the chaos of a foreign airport, his face pale, his entire world collapsing around him in a public, humiliating spectacle. Then came the question I had been waiting for, the last, desperate cry of a boy who had never truly grown up, a question so steeped in self-pity it was almost pathetic. "But what about me?" he whispered, his voice cracking, filled with the disbelief of a prince who has just been told he is a pauper. I closed my eyes, a profound and final sadness washing over me. It was the sadness of a finished chapter, of a love that had run its course. "That," I said softly, "is something you need to ask yourself." And with that, I ended the call. The final click was a sound of absolute finality. The silence that returned to my house was different now. For the first time in a very long time, it felt like peace. Peace. It was a foreign feeling, but a welcome one. For a week, my house had been a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, not a lonely void. The ghosts of anger and betrayal had been exorcised by the finality of my decision. I spent my days praying, tending to Robert's small rose garden, and preparing my home, truly my home again, for the arrival of my grandchildren. I remembered them at the airport buried under a mountain of luxurious luggage, leaving for a life of opulence they believed was their birthright. The contrast was a painful lesson I prayed they would one day understand. A week after my fateful call, a battered yellow taxi, a stark contrast to the sleek black car that had taken them away, pulled up to my curb. Amelia emerged, looking like a ghost of the triumphant, glamorous woman who had left JFK. Her expensive clothes were rumpled and stained, her hair was unkempt, and her face was a mask of bitter, silent exhaustion. She pulled Lily and Thomas from the car. Their small hands clutched a single, shared backpack that looked worn and dirty. There was no mountain of luggage this time. She marched them to my front door and pushed them gently forward, a final, resentful shove. She didn't say a word. She just gave me one look, a look of pure, undiluted hatred, before turning on her heel and getting back into the waiting cab, which sped away as if fleeing a plague. The children looked up at me, their faces smudged with tears and confusion. "Grandma," Lily whispered, her small voice trembling, "where's Daddy?" Later that afternoon, David Chen called. His voice was professionally somber, devoid of any satisfaction. "Francis, I thought you should know. The repossession orders went through this morning. The landlord has changed the locks on their rental house, and the leasing company has towed both of their cars. The collapse was total and swift. They had nothing left in Connecticut but the clothes on their backs and the consequences of their choices. The final piece, fell into place late that night. The phone rang, a tinny distant sound that I knew could only be one person. It was Jackson, calling from a payphone at a bus station somewhere in New Jersey. He must have borrowed money from a stranger for the fare back from the airport. His voice was hollow, stripped of everything but the raw desperation of a man who has lost everything. "Mom," he pleaded, the word catching in his throat, a sound of pure agony. "I'm back. Please, can I come home? I have nowhere else to go." I took a breath, my heart aching for the boy he once was, but my resolve firm for the man he needed to become. "I'm selling the house, Jackson," I said, my voice gentle but unyielding. "It's time for a new chapter for me and for you. You need to stand on your own 2 feet now." The silence on the other end was a bottomless well of despair. I could hear the distant announcement of a bus departure, a stark reminder of his rootless, transient new reality. Then, his voice, barely a whisper, cracked with the question I knew was coming, the question of a man staring into the abyss. "But where will I go?" I paused, letting the reality of his new independence settle upon him, a cold and heavy blanket. "That," I replied softly, "is something you'll have to figure out for yourself." I hung up the phone, severing the last thread of his old life, and prayed he had the strength to build a new one. Selling the house was like closing the final, beloved, painful chapter of a very long book. As I signed the last document, I felt not a sense of loss, but of liberation. That home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a monument to a broken trust, and I was finally free of its ghosts. 6 months had passed since that cold January morning. I now lived in a sun-drenched penthouse apartment overlooking the city, a place of light and air, so different from the heavy memories of my old life. I had taken temporary custody of Lily and Thomas, creating a stable, loving home for them while Jackson worked to put his life back together. The silence here was not lonely, it was filled with their gentle chatter and the quiet hum of a life reclaimed. Following Robert's true wish, a wish for our wealth to be a blessing, not a burden. I had dedicated a significant portion of the trust to the outreach programs at St. Mary's. I spent my afternoons volunteering at the food pantry and helping to organize support for families in need. The money, which had been the source of so much pain, was now a source of healing, not just for me, but for others. It was the legacy Robert had truly intended. Jackson came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon to pick up the children for the weekend. He looked older, tired, the arrogance stripped away by months of hard, ordinary work at a construction job. He was thinner, humbled. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make excuses. As he stood in the doorway watching Lily and Thomas gather their things, he looked at me, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow I had never seen before. "Thank you for taking care of them, Mom," he said, his voice quiet. It was the first honest thing he had said to me in years. The following Sunday, I sat in my usual pew at St. Mary's. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass window, just as it had on that terrible afternoon when I had wrestled with my faith. But today, there was no turmoil. My prayer was no longer a desperate plea for guidance, but a quiet whisper of gratitude. Gratitude for the strength I had been given, for the peace I had found, and for the difficult path that had led me back to myself. That evening, a year to the day since that fateful Christmas, the scent of gingerbread and cinnamon once again filled my home. Lily and Thomas stood on chairs beside me, their hands dusted with flour, cutting out star-shaped Christmas cookies, a tradition I thought had been lost forever. Their laughter was real, their joy untainted. I looked over at the small framed photo of Robert I kept on the kitchen counter. A genuine smile touched my lips. I had protected his legacy. I had found my freedom. And in the wreckage of the family I had lost, I was building a new one, founded not on obligation or greed, but on the simple, enduring truth of love. As the sweet scent of gingerbread cookies fills my new kitchen, a tradition I thought had been stolen from me forever, I finally understand the lesson this painful journey has taught me. Protecting your peace is not selfishness. It is an act of profound self-respect. True family is built on respect, not entitlement, and it never, ever comes with a price tag. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to draw a difficult boundary to reclaim your own story?